Her name was Margaret Brown, and she embodied the new wealthy class emerging on the scene in the early 20th century. A nouveau riche American, experiencing all that Europe had to offer in the pre-war years, she was returning back to the States in the lap of luxury that only the RMS Titanic could provide. Little did she know that the crucible that awaited her and her fellow passengers on this doomed voyage would be something she would never forget. Her survival would prove to be a godsend to those surviving passengers left with little but the clothes on their backs. Past Access DYK presents Episode 2 of the Titanic Heroes, Margaret Brown. Good evening and welcome to Past Access DYK, Titanic Heroes. I'm your host, Pete Coleman. Of the survivors of the Titanic, few would match the celebrity status of American Margaret Brown. It was a spotlight she did not seek and would not enjoy. However, the notoriety would serve her well in her many philanthropic endeavors. Many Titanic survivors would forever be indebted to her for her help in securing funds, lodging, and clothing once they reached New York. She was also a unique eyewitness to the tragedy of the sinking of the Titanic. Our scene opens in the midst of emerging chaos. The RMS Titanic was already listing portside and her bow was starting to slip. The Titanic's sinking was inevitable and the White Star Line officers were starting to evacuate passengers to lifeboats. Second Officer Charles Lightoller pleaded with several women to please step in one of the lifeboats. Loading the lifeboats had to be orderly and proceeded with calm. Lightoller announced, "Women and children only, please. Please step forward with women and children." With that, several of the hesitant women were helped into the lifeboat number 6. Margaret Tobin Brown was one of these women ushered into the boat that evening. She was wearing a winter coat with a cumbersome life-preserving vest across her chest. As she took her place on the boat containing 27 passengers, the commotion on the portside deck started to increase as crewmen followed the officer's orders to start lowering away. With a jerk and a drop of a few feet, lifeboat number 6 lurched downward towards the sea, down the side of the Belfast-made steel plating of one of the largest moving structures ever made by man. Just as lifeboat number 6 pushed away, rockets were fired from the top deck into the moonless sky in desperate hopes to signal any nearby vessels for assistance. The 28 souls on lifeboat 6 belonged to the RMS Titanic, and on this lifeboat was a woman that proved to be as legendary as the ship disaster she just survived. History would later name her the unsinkable Molly Brown, but on this night, Margaret Brown was not a celebrity but a concerned survivor, an absolute pillar of strength in those hours of uncertainty, horror, and survival. The loss of the Titanic was a maritime tragedy that the world would not soon forget. You see, the Titanic was an engineering marvel of the day, and as a first-class passenger, Margaret Brown was among the era's elite, rubbing elbows with a who's who of the day when she boarded the ill-fated liner in Cherbourg just 4 days earlier. I doubt Margaret Brown ever thought she would be considered part of the nouveau riche of the early 20th century, as she started out as a child worker, tearing tobacco leaves for a farming company on the banks of the Mississippi River. The new elite status was a far cry from her humble beginnings. She was born to Irish Catholic immigrants that settled in Hannibal, Missouri. Later, her family relocated to a log cabin in Leadville, Colorado. As a young woman, she met and married James Joseph Brown and lived a modest life until he struck it rich through a brokered share of an ore mining operation in Colorado. Their meteoric rise into high society was met with mixed reviews, yet Margaret was able to balance her compassion for the poor and the downtrodden with her taste for the finer things in life. She was known as a bit of a Francophile, immersing herself in European culture and travel. It was here, in 1912, that she and her daughter Helen traveled Europe and Egypt with the John Jacob Astor Party. The push to secure passage on the Titanic was due to the news that her grandson in America was very, very ill. Her daughter stayed behind in Europe as Margaret booked first-class passage on the maiden voyage of the Titanic with the Astor Party. Because of this hasty decision, not many in her family, other than her daughter, knew of her travel plans on the Titanic. All of this recent history must have seemed inconsequential with the survival task at hand that cold April night. Lifeboat number 6 was the second lifeboat lowered into the sea. Because these were the earliest lifeboats launched, they were unfortunately well under capacity limits. Panic had not yet set in with the passengers just before 1 a.m., but all that would change in the next hour or so. By the time Lifeboat 6 was about 100 yards from the ship, the Titanic bow was just about submerged. Quartermaster Hitchens was despondent, muttering all the ways the tiny boat would meet her doom.
We gotta get away from the ship. Keep pulling. You on the starboard side, you're not pulling even. Sorry, sir. Pull!
Under stressful situations, one's character and resilience comes to the surface. Quartermaster Hitchens was a person not known to be too optimistic on the lifeboat. Margaret Brown would lock horns with him on several occasions while in the boat, at least according to the account she gave the New York Times a week later. The coxswain Quartermaster Robert Hitchens began to argue with Miss Brown on the dangers of returning to the ship, stating that they needed to stay clear of the ship to avoid the suction that would most certainly kill them. He yelled back to Brown, "I'm in charge here, and that will be enough from you."
Stop! We have to go back!
No! The suction will pull us down if we don't keep going.
We've lots more room! I say we go back!
No! It's our lives now, not theirs. And I'm in charge of this boat, madam. Now row!
By 1:30 a.m., the situation was becoming dire. Survivors in Lifeboat 4 were pulling away from the ship and reported seeing floating furniture through the porthole on B deck. The scene must have been surreal as Margaret Brown's boat floated in the dark ocean, just far enough to still hear the voices of panic and see the brilliant lights of the liner still aglow as she was sinking faster by the bow. The sounds of the great ship breaking and air pockets exploding would have been heard by all survivors in the lifeboats. The death groans from the ship would have paused for a few moments as the stern was momentarily perpendicular to the ocean, and then started to slip. With the lights out on the doomed ship, all that was left was the sounds of Titanic's final plunge and the life struggling in the water. Margaret Brown and several of the fellow survivors began to call Hitchens to task to turn back for the survivors in the water. They all must have known time was limited for a rescue, but Hitchens barked back, "Survivors will swamp the boat. It's our lives now, not theirs."
There's plenty of room for more!
And there'll be one less on this boat.
If you don't shut that hole in your face!
The members of Lifeboat 6 were disgusted by Hitchens' behavior, but there was some truth to the idea that rowing back immediately to the scene would have been a death sentence. Several hundred people were floating in certain areas, desperate for any chance of survival. Only one boat went back after transferring passengers to another lifeboat, with minimal success. Survivors spent those hours praying, rowing, and trying to keep the mood light, not knowing when help would arrive. We will step aside for a moment, and upon our return, Margaret Brown and the Titanic survivors find hope in the early morning hours of April 15th as the RMS Carpathia comes to the rescue. So stay tuned. Coming up on Past Access, we travel to one of Europe's most visited destinations, the City of Light, Paris. Built upon pagan and Roman fortifications, this thriving capital city is held in the highest regard in art, culinary expression, and romantic aesthetics. Parisians have survived Viking and Germanic invasions, domestic revolutions, and the constant threat of the ever-present day Union strike. We tour Gustave Eiffel's hard-to-miss tower, float along the Seine River, explore the Louvre and d'Orsay, and remember the victims of the Reign of Terror. And if there's time, we pay a visit to an American cultural icon and pay our respects to a hero of the American Revolution. Lafayette, we are here. All this and more on the next Past Access from Paris, the City of Light. The story of the RMS Titanic has captivated generations of people all around the globe. This disaster still resonates with countless individuals even more than a century later. Past Access and Podcasting Productions are proud to present the Titanic Log Book, a perfect companion on your next trip to learn more about all things Titanic. From the Titanic Museum in Belfast, Northern Ireland, to the Titanic Experience in Las Vegas, Nevada, this little logbook allows you to jot down information on the various authentic artifacts recovered from the depths of the Atlantic, document the biographical sketches of the passengers and crew, and rate your overall experience as an amateur historian and Titanic enthusiast. Grab your copy today as you plan your next trip, and remember, you can find the Titanic Logbook at Amazon.com and on the Amazon Marketplace worldwide. Those early morning hours were full of despair for the survivors on the lifeboats, but hope, coming at heroic speed, was on its way. Captain Arthur Rostron pushed the ship, the RMS Carpathia, through a crowded iceberg field in the dead of night, at great risk to his ship and crew. By dawn's light, the Carpathia was on the horizon, seen by many of the tiny lifeboats scattered across the ocean. Many of the lifeboats were spread far apart when the dawn broke. Survivors could see a field of icebergs all around them. All aboard this little lifeboat were rescued by the Carpathia around 6 a.m. in the morning. Once on board the Carpathia, Margaret Brown was very busy trying to reach out to many of the survivors that lost husbands and fathers, many that had not a penny to their name. Margaret Brown would later write in her words,
"By the time we reached the Carpathia, a heavy sea was running. Our boat being the last in, we found it difficult to get close. 3 or 4 unsuccessful attempts were made. A rope was thrown to us, and we were hoisted up to where a dozen of the crew and officers and doctors were clustered. Stimulants were given to those who needed them."
Keep this in mind. Once rescued, it was not a quick run to New York. The Carpathia took 3.5 days to reach New York City. 3.5 days of coming to grips with the tragedy and the uncertainty that was yet to come when arriving to America. She spent her time trying to radio back to New York to make sure that there was preparations for them when they came into the harbor. This was Margaret Brown's most significant work, assisting those in need, still in a state of shock and despair. By the time Carpathia reached New York Harbor, chartered boats filled with newspaper writers were escorting the Carpathia to the docks, yelling questions to the survivors, passengers, and crew in order to scoop the other competitive newspapers on the tragedy. The country was eager for credible information on who survived and who did not. Understandably, Margaret Brown's family would have been beside themselves after hearing of the sinking of the Titanic until they read the survivors list. A handwritten letter to her daughter would have been a treasured document. You can still hear her folksy southern drawl in her words about surviving the Titanic sinking.
"After being brined, salted, and pickled in mid-ocean, I am now high and dry. I have had flowers, letters, telegrams, people until I am befuddled. They are petitioning Congress to give me a medal. If I must call a specialist to examine my head, it is due to the title of Heroine of the Titanic."
Margaret Brown would obtain international celebrity status as she reached New York. She had helped establish the Survivors Committee, which elected her as chair and raised almost $10,000 for destitute survivors. Margaret's language skills in French, German, and Russian were an asset as she remained on the Carpathia until all the Titanic survivors had met with family, friends, or medical and emergency assistance. She was particularly upset as a woman she was not allowed to testify at the Titanic hearings. In response, she wrote her own version of the events, which were published in newspapers in Denver, New York, and in Paris. They broke the mold when they made Margaret Brown. She was a driven and determined woman, a force of nature, some would say. Her legacy and legend would continue to grow after her death in 1932. A Broadway musical named The Unsinkable Molly Brown also graced the silver screen, and in 1965, NASA astronaut Gus Grissom officially named Gemini 3 for the unsinkable Molly Brown. Thus, their safe return back to Earth might have been attributed to her namesake. In life, Margaret Brown used her celebrity to create good in the world. She was a survivor in every sense of the word, a philanthropist during the Great War, a rescuer of those in need during the Titanic sinking. She was an amazing woman. We want to thank you for joining us tonight on Past Access DYK Titanic Heroes. We have a lot more information coming up on our series on Titanic Heroes throughout the year. So if you want that information, go to pastaccess.com. So until next time, from Prague, I'm Pete Coleman. Have a good night.
This has been Past Access Did You Know with Pete Coleman. For more information on this topic or other DYK shows, please visit us at pastaccess.com. Be sure to visit our Past Access YouTube channel, like and subscribe.